So welcome everyone to the ADBI featured speaker webinar on sanitation education development with Professor Anjali Adukia. So she's an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. She's also faculty research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research and faculty affiliate of the University of Chicago Education Lab and Crime Lab. Some house rules: we will be using Zoom throughout the session. Please turn off your video and mute your mic when lecturer is speaking. All the video and audio buttons are at the bottom of your screen. You can also comment or answer in the Zoom chat box. Click raise your hand, and the whole session will be recorded, and we will have a brief photo session at the end of the seminar. We will be also using menti.com for your questions. Just go to menti.com. You can open another browser on your laptop or on your phone and type the code 4976543. So that's menti.com and type the code 4976543. If you open menti.com, you should see this page and then simply type the code 4976543. Submit, and you can simply type your questions there. So anytime throughout the session. Our agenda, we will begin with the opening remarks from Dean Sonobe and Dr. Brita. We will then proceed to the presentation of Professor Anjali. We'll have the open discussions with our two discussants and the open Q&A. Then we will have the closing remarks and brief photo session. And finally, the wrap up and a very short feedback survey. So our opening remarks will be delivered by our Dean and CEO at ADBI, Dr. Tetsushi Sonobe, and a brief opening message from Dr. Brita Augsburg, Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So the IFS is one of our co-organizers in the Sanitation and Development series of ADBI. Our moderator during the open discussions is Dr. Peter Morgan. He's the Senior Consulting Economist and Vice Chair for Research of ADBI. Our two discussants are Professor Jennifer Ergelmeyer and Dr. Jaswara Rao. Professor Jennifer is an assistant professor of government, public policy, and public health at the Franklin Marshall College. Dr. Jaswara Rao is the additional secretary of Niti Aayog in India, focusing on urban development and urban poverty alleviation, skill development, labor, and employment. And then our closing remarks will be delivered by Dr. K. Sitharam, our senior capacity building and training specialist at ADBI. And then we will have our short feedback survey via Menti at the end. And with that, I give the floor to our Dean, Tetsushi Sonobe, for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Rani-san. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Tokyo. Welcome to ADB Institute webinar. Today's ADBI featured speaker is Professor Anjali Adukia of the Harris School of Public Policy and the College, the University of Chicago. She is going to present her paper on sanitation, education, and development. This study uses unique microdata of children in India who benefited from the total sanitation campaign in 2003 to delve into the impact of sanitation facilities on gender parity in schooling. We are also privileged to have two distinguished discussants with us. Professor Jennifer Ergelmeyer, Franklin and Marshall College, Pennsylvania, and Dr. Rajeswara Rao of the National Institution for Transforming India. Thank you, Anjali, Jennifer, and Rajeswara for taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your insights. ADBI is planning to hold several webinars on sanitation and development this year because of the timeliness and the relevance of the topic. I hope that a good start will be made today. Yeah, I had about a month ago, when I talked with one of my high school classmates who is a manufacturer, and then he mentioned about this topic of pubescent age girl sanitation issue in school because his company is manufacturing a very low cost toilet facility, and then also selling. So he has been operating that company for already a few years, and then he's very proud of selling such facilities at less than $10 or usually about $5 across the developing world. I didn't know that already empirical analysis has been performed, and then yeah, I'm very happy to hear today's presentation. So I really look forward to a fruitful discussion over the ensuing 2 hours. Thank you for your attention. Rani-san, over to you.
Thank you, Din Sonobe. Now, let's see Dr. Brita's opening message. Can we please show her video?
Thank you. Just a few words from my side. My name is Patal Spock. I'm Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, the UK. We're very excited about the engagement with the ADBI and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on various activities, including this seminar series, aimed at strengthening the case for sanitation and development by putting a spotlight on empirical evidence. One might be tempted to argue that the case for WASH investment has been convincingly made, and it's probably even fair to say that there's general agreement that the benefits of investing outweigh the costs. However, when digging a bit deeper, it becomes clear that important questions related to the how, when, and who, and in fact also the why, remain unanswered. So I'm very pleased that the seminar series is starting with Anjali presenting her work on school sanitation and educational decisions. And that's especially for 2 reasons. Not only is she conducting a rigorous and careful impact evaluation of a school latrine construction initiative in India, and by doing so, she's quantifying not so well documented short and medium-term benefits. But she's also examining the mechanisms behind identified impacts and thereby providing crucial information for a better understanding of how to design interventions and how to allocate resources more efficiently. I'm also very much looking forward to the discussions by Jennifer and Rajeshwara Rao, who I'm certain will bring up interesting points for discussion and thinking both from an academic and practitioner perspective.
So thank you very much for that. We can now proceed to the presentation of Professor Anjali, please.
Great. Thank you all so much for having me and for coming this morning. My name is Anjali Adukia. I'm at the University of Chicago. In my research, I seek to understand the factors that influence educational decisions, and in particular, my work examines how the provision of basic needs through schools can encourage school participation. Basic needs such as sanitation, clothing, and economic security. And today, I will be discussing the role of school sanitation on educational outcomes in India. And it's really exciting that ADBI has decided to, really spotlight this issue of sanitation, which I think sometimes is less glamorous than a lot of the other topics, but yet so important. So thank you to all of you. So 1 in 5 children of upper primary school age remain out of school in the world. And this problem is especially stark in India, which is home to 1/4 of the out-of-school children in the world. Girls in developing countries are disproportionately affected, with 1/4 of them not completing primary school. There have been various attempts to increase female educational attainment in developing countries, with a particular push from the Millennium Development Goals and then the Sustainable Development Goals, which included a focus on the promotion of gender equality in education. Now, in dealing with issues of gender inequality, there have been some that have focused on the idea that menstruation creates an obstacle to female schooling, contributing to high dropout rates among pubescent age girls. I call this the menstruation hypothesis. And this belief has motivated efforts to provide sex-specific sanitation in schools, with the idea that it can improve the school environment for girls during their menstrual periods. However, an overly narrow focus on a girl's few menstrual days may obscure the larger everyday issues of health, privacy, and safety facing both girls and boys. Oops. So in this study, I'm interested in understanding how improving the health, privacy, and safety of the school environment influences the educational decisions of children across different ages. Specifically, my main analysis examines how school latrine construction impacts student enrollment. Beyond changes in enrollment, I look at impacts on achievement outcomes from state board exams. And I also examine the persistence of any impacts over time. To try to understand the mechanisms behind these impacts, I explore whether these estimates are consistent with this menstruation hypothesis, in which I look at differential impacts by gender and age. Now, to analyze these issues, I use a change in national Indian policy to provide identifying variation. So in the early 2000s, there were a large number of resources devoted towards the construction of school latrines in India through a national initiative called the School Sanitation and Hygiene Education Program, or SSHE. From a policy perspective, it's important to understand the impact of spending such resources on school latrines. But this initiative is also useful in trying to understand the role of sanitation in schools from an empirical standpoint. Schools with latrines may differ systematically from schools without latrines, but potential selection bias in the cross-section can be overcome by looking at changes in schools that receive a latrine relative to changes in similar schools in the same district that do not receive a latrine. Now, of course, schools that receive latrines may otherwise change differently than those that do not receive latrines. So in the empirical analysis, I try to address associated concerns by focusing on changes among similar treatment and similar comparison schools, either by controlling for initial school characteristics interacted with year or matching on initial school characteristics. And I explore robustness through a variety of sensitivity checks. And to do this, I obtained and cleaned administrative data from an annual census of Indian schools called DICE, which allow me to estimate the impact of school latrine construction on educational outcomes for students. Now, as an exercise to help understand the underlying mechanisms, I look at the impact of latrine construction on the share of female teachers, as work by people like Michael Kramer and co-authors indicates that one reason why female teachers may be absent from school is due to the absence of sanitation facilities. I also explore whether enrollment effects are larger in schools with more female teachers initially. In thinking further about the mechanisms underlying these effects, it's also really useful to consider differential impacts by latrine type. So there are some schools that received resources to build sex-specific latrines, meaning separate latrines for girls and boys, whereas other schools received resources to build unisex latrines, which are shared facilities among girls and boys. Now, these estimates are naturally going to be more suggestive because of selection bias concerns in which schools receive latrines of different types. But if privacy and safety concerns are central for pubescent age girls, then the construction of separate sex-specific latrines may be the most important, with little impact from the construction of unisex latrines. By contrast, if unisex latrines are mostly sufficient at younger ages, then large effects may reflect important impacts through improved child health. Understanding these differential impacts not only helps illustrate potential mechanisms, but is also of practical importance in deciding where to direct scarce resources. It's important to understand when unisex latrines are sufficient and when separate sex-specific latrines are needed. Sanitation is a significant policy issue with substantial resources being put into it. In 2012 alone, UNICEF spent over $380 million on sanitation. Something that is this big of a deal deserves a large-scale evaluation to really influence what people are doing. But there had not been a large-scale evaluation of school sanitation. And finally, a real advantage to having a large-scale setting with a large administrative data set is that it allows me to explore the external validity of these estimates. In particular, I examined the geographic heterogeneity in the effects across districts with different cultural norms and income levels. To give you a sense of the variation in my sample, if you compare districts with average income at the 10th and 90th percentiles in my sample, it's comparable to variation across countries between the 5th and 25th percentiles of the world income distribution. So examples of countries at these ends include Rwanda and Nepal at the 5th percentile and Georgia and Ukraine at the 25th percentile. And there's not much systematic data, on this issue in other developing countries. There's one study by Oster and Thornton where they studied girls in 4 schools in one Nepali district and found that they were not more likely to miss school during their periods, and that the provision of menstrual cups had no effect on their attendance. But while the quantitative evaluation of a menstruation management technology may show no benefits where school absences are rare during girls' few menstrual days each month, a broader menstruation hypothesis might emphasize how girls are impacted every day by the physical, emotional, and societal changes that happen with the onset of menstruation, and that their educational decisions may be more impacted by addressing the everyday concerns for health, safety, and privacy, such as through the provision of sex-specific school latrines. In addition, a narrow focus on menstruation might overlook other factors that influence education decision-making for pubescent age boys and younger children, thus obscuring a broader link between school sanitation and education. So just to preview the results, I find that school latrines increase student enrollment and lower dropout for all students. These changes are also reflected in the number of students who show up and pass the middle school board exam. And while the impact of educational infrastructure interventions can fade out over time, I find that the impact of latrines on enrollment is still present or even slightly stronger 3 years later. I also find that the impact of a latrine is similar across the 269 districts in my sample, despite the significant heterogeneity across these states. Now, consistent with the menstruation hypothesis, I find that a latrine generally increases female enrollment more than male enrollment. However, latrine type matters greatly. The construction of a unisex latrine has a greater impact on pubescent age boys than pubescent age girls. And pubescent age girls benefit very little from a unisex latrine, but they benefit greatly from a sex-specific latrine just for girls. Furthermore, a latrine increases the share of female teachers, which may lead to benefits for female students. Now, inconsistent with a narrow focus on menstruation, I find that while the impact of a latrine is substantial for pubescent age girls, younger girls and boys actually experience larger benefits from the presence of a latrine. And for younger children, unisex latrines may be sufficient with relatively smaller additional gains from sex-specific latrines, which suggests that latrines may have important impacts for child health. Aspects of these results suggest that indeed a menstruation hypothesis may be at play, where educational decisions of pubescent age girls are influenced by the onset of puberty. However, a broader view is necessary, and these results really illustrate the varying importance of health, privacy, and safety for children of different genders and ages, which is useful to understand when trying to allocate scarce resources. So just to, outline, the talk, first I'll tell you a bit about the school sanitation initiative that I'm using to provide the identifying variation, followed by a brief discussion about the relationship between sanitation and education. Then I'll tell you a bit more about the administrative data sets, and briefly describe the empirical methodology that I'm using to estimate my results. I'll then show you the findings and discuss some of the potential mechanisms underlying these impacts, and then I'll conclude. And I welcome any questions. So, over half of primary schools in India had no kind of sanitation facility in 2002. And a natural question is, what's the market failure here, right? If school sanitation has such obvious benefits, then why don't all schools already have facilities? In developing contexts, there's this common notion that money is just left on the table, where possible gains from basic solutions are missed. And Mariel Snell from the International Rescue Committee calls it innocent ignorance. And I actually had conducted, about 140 interviews with headmasters at different schools. And, continuously, people were very surprised that I would even ask about sanitation facilities. I'd say, kids don't need them, they do what, they go, before school or after school. And if they really need to go during the day, they do what we've been doing for, hundreds of years and just go in the beautiful open outdoors. Now, to address this, the government of India decided to take on the issue of eradicating open defecation by encouraging schools to provide sanitation facilities, because they believe this notion of that, kids could actually be these social change agents. And, if you target a school, that there might actually be these really great spillover effects into communities. And this initiative was bolstered by the Millennium Development Goals, in which it was suggested that school sanitation could help address several of their goals, including increasing school participation, promoting gender equality in education, combating disease, and ensuring environmental sustainability through the containment of waste. Now, you'll see that, so there was low take up originally in 2000. And so in 2003, the government began to provide substantial financial resources for latrine construction. And so you can see that, like, here in 2001 and 2002, the government was encouraging schools to provide latrines, but they weren't actually providing any kind of financial assistance. And so, but suddenly in 2003, there is this large increase in the number of school latrines that were built. And that's because of the resources that were actually provided by SSHE. And, due to resource constraints, the program was rolled out gradually over the subsequent years. And the rollout looked different in different places. Some districts attempted to prioritize schools with the greatest demonstrated need. Others claim to have followed a lottery-style selection process, and yet others simply began by constructing latrines in schools closest to the district office. And generally, school latrine construction through this program was managed by the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation rather than by educational officials. There was actually very little communication across the departments. In fact, a lot of education departments, really said, oh, that's Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation. This is not our issue. In fact, the standard World Bank school that was built for a long time didn't actually even include a sanitation facility. It was really just about the classrooms. And so, this is a pattern often in policy, that there's this policy incoherence across policy areas. And, but this is also important that they didn't talk, because it meant that there was no explicit trade-off in other educational inputs, right? So it's not that you didn't get a blackboard, but, you got a latrine. And, the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation was not likely to actually have information on initial school characteristics. So SSHE had several components, but latrine construction was by far the main component. It also included hygiene education and small-scale investments in water. And, in the Indian context, by small-scale investments, I mean giving the school a bucket to hold water. But, there are these stories, like, for example, in Odisha, where they would give buckets and then within a week they were all gone. Or the hygiene education, was comprised of, like, we're going to pass out or send, posters. But, again, they were, if not put up, then, often they disappeared pretty quickly. And, the SSHE itself was actually part of something called the broader Total Sanitation Campaign. But that was very focused on household sanitation. And again, these efforts were also kept separate. The programs themselves were managed by UNICEF, and they implemented them in 6 other countries. And so, up until now, there hadn't been a quantitative empirical evaluation of large-scale school latrine construction initiatives. But a wide body of research does suggest that school latrines could be important for educational outcomes, especially for pubescent age girls. And the general prior is that sanitation facilities can provide privacy for girls and make school a safer place, which can then in turn encourage parents to enroll their daughters in school. So, especially for those who may not be familiar with, like, the different sanitation options that children may face, first I just kind of want to, like, have you imagine, like, so consider the situation of a 12-year-old girl who's just gotten her period and her body is starting to undergo many changes. So what are her options in terms of relieving herself, right? So if her school has no sanitation facility, she could just stay home, or she could risk the embarrassment of exposing herself to her classmates, or try to find a hidden place behind bushes while exposing herself to the risk of sexual assault, right? Even if her school has sanitation facilities that are shared among boys and girls, does she then risk exposing her body to a boy who might be going next to her, or being targeted by boys who may wait by the bathrooms to harass her? Or does she hope that her school will have separate facilities for boys and girls so she can have privacy? And these are just some of the struggles that I heard from girls during my visits to schools. Before I started this project, I was visiting schools for an education microfinance project. I remember using a teacher's latrine, and I was struck by how clean it was. And so I was curious about the student restrooms. And so I asked, one of the girls, I said, oh, where do you go to the restroom? And she pointed behind the school sign, behind the bushes and into the open field. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And so then I started asking asking children at every school and household I visited. And that's when the stories came out. One girl talked about the story of Jyoti, who went behind the bushes and, there were, boys who did bad things to her and, she had to leave school. And of course she was the one who had to leave school, not the boys. And, this girl would say, or said, I'm so scared it'll happen to me that I don't eat or drink during the day. Sometimes I feel faint or dizzy, but it's better than the alternative. Or, during a household visit, this young kid, it was 11 saying, oh, I had to, miss, she was talking about the wonders of school. And I said, well, it's during the school day. Why aren't you in school? And she said, oh, I have to miss, a few days every month, because of my period. And I missed during exams. They wouldn't let me retake them. So I failed out. And so I just kept hearing these stories. And so it made me really think about like, oh, well, gee, like what are some of the factors that are at play that are making girls drop out? But it's actually not just about girls, right? Sanitation can work through other channels as well. Boys themselves actually may really benefit from the added safety and privacy of separate latrines, right? They actually, based on the child psychology literature, they tend to be the primary victims of bullying, particularly younger boys. And they may also not feel as comfortable urinating in the presence of others, but there's a stigma for boys to actually talk about their feelings or talk about what it is that may be bothering them. Moreover, if waste is not contained, it can lead to groundwater contamination or surface soil pollution, which can then lead to negative health outcomes that can cause students to miss school. And then finally, female teachers may be more likely to show up if there are latrines available for them to use, and it's been suggested that the presence of female teachers encourages girls' enrollment. So my main data set is drawn from administrative data of an annual census of Indian primary and upper primary schools registered with the government, and it's called the District Information System for Education, or DICE database. So for each year, these data include the number of enrolled students by sex and age, examination outcomes for middle school board exams, including the number of students who took the test, passed the test, and scored high marks on the test. And then there's a set of infrastructure data, including the presence of latrines by latrine type, the number of teachers, and whether the teachers are female or male. And DICE data collection itself was initiated as a pilot in 1995, but systematic data collection mechanisms were not established until 2001. And, the Indian government currently only makes DICE data widely available for years after 2005, but I was thankfully able to obtain and clean the raw data from earlier years. And, there are schools that move in and out of the sample in some years, especially in early years. But I was able to construct a large continuous panel of 140,000 primary and upper primary schools for the academic years of 2002, 2003, and 2005, among which over 40,000 schools built latrines in that year, 2003. The reason I don't include 2004 is because there was a large server error in India where most of the data from 2004 was unfortunately lost. And it's logistically challenging to collect data from throughout India, but the DICE data reflect a multi-state data collection process culminating in the hiring of independent agencies to verify the data. I accompanied some of the survey teams to understand the quality of the data, and actually we found that in general, the information was often accurate with the exception of more subjective variables such as building repair status that would be like very good or in need of repair, or what percent of this building is pakka or kacha, meaning, made of like concrete materials versus raw materials. And I also use supplemental data sources from the Census of India and the Planning Commission for extensions of my analysis, especially when thinking about that geographic heterogeneity. To give you a sense, my data cover 9 states, 269 of the 593 districts in India, which is a substantial portion of the country. In my analysis, so, I use a kind of a basic differences approach. And so I define a treatment school as a school that didn't have a latrine in 2001 and 2002, but they do construct a latrine in 2003. And then my comparison group consists of schools that never had a latrine in any year of my sample frame. And so in this design, what I'm doing is I'm comparing post-treatment outcomes. So in this case, the outcomes you could think of as school enrollment of this treatment group of schools that received a latrine to pre-treatment outcomes. So like looking before 2003 of these same schools that received a latrine, and then I adjust for changes, that might be happening over time by using changes in that control group of schools that don't have a latrine. And so again, I look at post-treatment outcomes for these control schools. So I look at enrollment after 2003, compared to enrollment before 2003 in these schools that didn't have a latrine, and then I, take the difference between those two differences. And so, this assumes that treatment schools and control schools would have changed similarly on average if it had not been for the construction of latrines in treatment schools. In this case, there are some meaningful differences between treatment and control schools, at least at baseline. As you can see, treatment schools tend to be larger than control schools. There are some differences in school infrastructure, and so while those differences can look meaningful, they actually, or can sometimes, while those differences are sometimes significant due to sample size, they're not necessarily substantial, nor are there monotonic differences that systematically favor one group over the other. So for example, while more treatment schools tend to have access to electricity, more control schools tend to have access to computers, whereas, and a school library, and it's similar for schools in the primary sample, but of course you need to have electricity for computers. And so it's unclear that one school is necessarily always better off than the other. While it might be ideal to randomly assign schools to treatment and control groups, such that the schools in each group look the same at baseline, it's not possible when trying to deal with real world policy situations and when you're really trying to look at this large scale. These tables do highlight some baseline differences in the raw data. And so in the empirical analysis, I focus on comparing treatment and control schools that were similar in 2002. And so I either control for these characteristics or I match on them. And so, just in terms of some basic regression or like estimation notes, I use a balanced panel of schools for my main specification. I cluster my standard errors at the school level. So that way I'm kind of, again, looking or, just making sure that I'm doing things within the school. I run the analysis separately for upper primary and primary schools so that the estimates can be compared across ages, and because a major threat of validity is the potential for schools that received latrines to have otherwise changed differently from schools that did not receive latrines, I probe robustness in a variety of ways. And I'll talk about some of them during the talk. And if people have questions, I'm happy to address them later on. So now to get to my results. So I show that, an average upper primary school receiving a latrine in 2003 experienced a statistically significant 8% relative increase in enrollment. Primary schools that received latrines had a 12% increase in enrollment. And this translates to an increase of approximately 5 upper primary school students and 12 primary school students. And here I show that girls are more impacted from the introduction of a latrine than boys on average. Older girls are more impacted by a latrine than older boys by about 2.5 percentage points. And the difference between younger girls and boys is slightly smaller. I don't actually have a direct measure of student dropout, so I use the enrollment data to construct a cohort-based measure of dropout. I define the fraction of students who drop out as the expected enrollment, which I derive from the previous year's enrollment, minus the current year's enrollment divided by that expected enrollment. And so for this measure, a negative coefficient indicates a decrease in the fraction of students who drop out. And you have to remember, this is only a measure of net dropout, as this could reflect new students in an area in addition to previously enrolled students who drop out from the school. And similar to the previous enrollment results, I show that latrines reduce the fraction of students who drop out by around, 5% for upper primary school students and 12% for younger students. Impacts of interventions often fade over time. And one concern is that latrine maintenance might be so bad that latrines quickly become unusable and ineffective. And the program, the SSHE program, explicitly targeted latrine construction with no specific provisions for ongoing latrine maintenance. So there may be concerns that the estimated impacts would be short-lived. But here, I present separately estimated impacts for latrines after 1 year and after 3 years. And the impact of latrines not only doesn't seem to fade over time. If anything, the impact seems to be slightly larger after 3 years. So now I'm going to show you estimated impacts of latrines on achievement. And this is specifically 8th grade students' performance on a middle school state board exam in Uttar Pradesh that's taken 9 months into the academic year. And there are 3 outcomes in the data. There's the number of students who appear for the exam, the number of students who pass the exam, and the number of students who score above a high mark threshold. Most students take the test and pass it. As 98% of students appear for the exam, this provides an independent verifying measure of school participation. If students appear for and then pass the examination, it suggests that these students are also attending school on a somewhat regular basis. Only 34% of students score high marks on the exam. And, here I present the impacts of latrines on the achievement, and so for a comparison, the introduction of a latrine increases these schools' 8th grade student enrollment by about 1.5 students. So, the estimated increases in appearing for the exam and passing the exam suggest that students are attending school throughout the year. However, I don't find an impact on the number of students who are scoring high marks on the exam. But it's fairly common to not find increases in high achievement from educational interventions that increase enrollment, yet bringing more children into school still generates standard returns to education. And also, it's unclear that a toilet, that a latrine actually would necessarily make you a star student, but you can imagine that it might have other impacts that help improve the school environment. But these estimates reflect a net impact of latrines on student achievement and do not indicate what would have happened to average achievement for students who would have gone to school in the absence of the intervention. These effects may be due to existing students performing better and/or new students performing well because of a healthier, more comfortable school environment in which they are better able to concentrate and which they are more likely to attend. Alternatively, if latrines increase enrollment without an associated increase in other school inputs, these effects could be picking up indirect negative effects on existing students performing worse due to potential classroom crowding, shortages in learning materials, or diffuse teacher attention. I also look at different potential comparison groups. Like there's always challenges, especially when you're dealing with a real world policy, issue, is to think about like what is the source of that second difference, the control group. And so I look at different, possibilities. So my main control group are those that didn't have a latrine in any of the years. I use an alternative comparison group for those that may have built a latrine after the first year, thinking that maybe they're more similar to the ones that built a latrine that first year. And, then there's, no new latrine was built, between 2002 and 2005. And, you see that the estimates are still positive and significant. They slightly decrease over time, but that's to be expected because now you're actually really comparing them to a very different kind of group altogether. I also check robustness in various ways, and so, with matching, there's always a concern that you can actually produce biased estimates. And so I employ many different matching techniques to ensure that my results are not sensitive to the choice of method. And here I'm just showing two of the techniques, one which is a very traditional approach, which is called nearest neighbor matching. And so based on like these baseline characteristics, like, you know, what is another school that has very similar characteristics as, you know, the treatment school, and then you compare those. And, you know, similarly for coarsened exact matching, you know, the data are coarsened, meaning like they're kind of collapsed at a larger level, like before you actually run the analysis, you know, and then there's exact matches performed on these data that are coarsened, you know, and then the analysis is run on the uncoarsened, you know, matched data, and the results don't meaningfully change. You know, there could be that, you know, other impacts from another good government initiative happening at the same time, because this was a time of great reform in India. So I control for changes in other school characteristics over time, and don't, you know, you don't actually see changes in the results. You know, the introduction of a latrine might also encourage students to transfer schools, right? So from one school to in a village to the school that now has constructed latrines. So then I restrict the sample to villages with only one school to minimize these displacement effects. Excuse me, in practice, most children go to school within their village, and most villages only have one school, but, you know, we don't see actually big changes in the results, you know. And then, you know, my primary outcome, I actually am using, like for the log results, I'm actually using log enrollment +1, because there are schools which have 0 enrollment of either girls or boys in some years. But this is, you know, an assumption being made, a functional form assumption. And so then I restrict the sample to schools that always have a positive enrollment of both girls and boys in all years. And then I estimate the regressions with both log enrollment and log enrollment +1 as the outcome variables. And the results similarly do not meaningfully change. You know, another concern is that measurement error in the enrollment data, you know, might increase the standard errors on the estimates. But there's this concern, a potential concern about mean reversion in the data. You know, so in theory, a treatment school and a comparison school may have had the same measured number of students initially. However, the treatment school may have had a larger actual number of students, which is known by the person making latrine allocation decisions, and that person targets larger schools. So then you might expect the treatment school to show a higher number of measured students in later years when the school gets a new draw from the measurement error distribution. But in practice, you know, administrators are unlikely to have been able to target latrines based on the actual number of students. You know, just 2 years before this initiative really shot up, you know, many of these districts didn't even know how many schools they had, which is one of the reasons that DICE was actually created. But somehow, you know, I want to account for this potential noise in the measurement. And so what I do to try to quantify this potential bias is that I use that data from the 8th grade state board exams as an independent measure of student enrollment. Because, you know, remember that, you know, 96% are actually passing the exam and 98% are actually showing up. And so then I replicate my main estimating equation, but for estimating cross-sectional differences in 2002, so the year before latrine construction increased. And the outcome variable is defined as the difference in the log number of students who appear for the exam and the log number of students enrolled. Now, if these are two independent measures of school enrollment, then mean reversion should be reflected in a positive coefficient on the treatment variable in year 2002, which assumes that the two measures are independent and identically distributed draws. And what I see is that actually I estimate small and statistically insignificant effects. And these estimates reject mean reversion bias contributing more than a 1.2% increase in school enrollment, you know, under the assumption that these two measures are IID. And then really to me, what's very exciting is then I explore these potential channels through which enrollment effects may be occurring. So first, I'm going to discuss differential impacts by latrine type, and then discuss results related to the impact of female teachers and their heterogeneous effects due to local variation in cultural norms or income. So schools were either assigned unisex latrines or sex-specific latrines for boys and girls. In a very few schools, in a few cases, schools were assigned a girls-only latrine, but as you can see, most schools built unisex latrines or separate latrines, and very few built them just for girls. But I'm going to leave them into the analysis because I actually think they say something very interesting about the underlying mechanisms. And there may be differential impacts by latrine type. So, if privacy is a bigger concern, then you shouldn't expect to see, much response to unisex latrines. But if health concerns are more important, then you should expect to see that children benefit regardless of the type of latrine that is built. This is useful not only from an economics perspective when understanding factors that contribute to education decision-making, but also from a policy perspective in deciding where to focus limited resources. So, what I do is in one regression, I actually have 6 parameters that are estimated, so 3 for, and again, I'm estimating these separately for upper primary, so older kids. So you think about these as pubescent age kids versus prepubescent age kids, which are the younger kids in 1st through 5th grades. And, there's 3 for girls, 3 for boys. The way you would look at this coefficient is like, this is the impact for girls in schools that built separate sex-specific latrines. This is the impact for girls, for pubescent age girls who in schools where they built only unisex latrines. And then I calculate the associated standard errors and their differences. And what I show is that female enrollment increased substantially from the construction of sex-specific latrines, but the construction of unisex latrines only slightly increases female enrollment. The enrollment of boys increased similarly with the construction of a unisex latrine and sex-specific latrines. And boys are not at all impacted by the construction of a girls' latrine, which is something that you might expect. Now, when you actually look at primary schools, by contrast, the construction of sex-specific latrines had similar impacts to the construction of a unisex latrine. Girls benefited slightly more from the construction of sex-specific latrines than unisex latrines, but only slightly more. Now, one thing that I think is actually very interesting is that it might seem strange that you actually see that younger boys, were impacted by the construction of girls-only latrines. But actually, from my visits to schools, when you actually talk to like 1st or 2nd grade teachers, they say, look, like these kids don't care about privacy. Like, they all go to the same bathroom. And, in practice, then you actually see that like, there is less of a concern at these younger ages. And, regardless of the designation of latrine, both boys and girls were using the same facilities. And, these estimates are insensitive to the robustness checks estimated for the initial results. And these differential impacts by latrine type are useful in thinking about the mechanisms underlying the main effects of latrines, right? In upper primary schools, the importance of sex-specific latrines suggests that privacy and sexual safety may be important channels. In primary schools, the relative sufficiency of unisex latrines suggests that student health may be an important channel. These estimates are also useful from a policy design perspective in directing resources toward what type of latrines might be built in what contexts. Sex-specific latrines benefit children at younger ages, but unisex latrines may be sufficient for younger children when resources are scarce. By contrast, school latrines seem to only improve gender parity among older children when sex-specific latrines are constructed. For pubescent age girls benefit very little from the construction of a unisex latrine. Now, I have teacher data available for 8,000 schools in 2 states, Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. And school latrines might impact students by changing female teachers' willingness to work. In one case, current female teachers might have improved work attendance when schools receive latrines. And so to explore this possibility, I look at, the interaction between having a latrine and a school's initial share of teachers. And I find that the impact of latrines is not generally higher in schools that have initial, higher share of female teachers. In another case, you can imagine that additional female teachers might begin to work at schools that receive latrines. Now, both of these effects might increase student enrollment, especially girls' enrollment. So what I do is I look at the fraction of teachers at a school that are female as the outcome variable. And I find that school latrine construction increases the share of female teachers at schools. Now, there is a smaller effect in schools that only built unisex latrines and a much larger increase in schools that built sex-specific latrines. And as a placebo test, I estimate the impact of latrine construction on the share of teachers from particular castes, and I find no impact because you actually would not expect that someone from one caste or another caste would actually care about latrine construction more. And then there's this question about like external validity. So, like places are very different across contexts. And so, how do these results change depending on the context? And so here I show histograms of the effects across districts, where the dotted line is the average effect, and this shows that the impact of latrines varies across India, which could reflect differences in underlying social factors or local economic opportunities. There is substantial variation around the average effect of a latrine, which could reflect random noise or be systematically correlated with district characteristics. The impact of latrines may be larger in areas with more gender parity, where girls might otherwise be encouraged to enroll in school. But the impact might also be larger in areas with more gender inequality, where there is the most unfulfilled potential to increase educational enrollment. And here I show, further motivating results at the state level, which show how the impact of latrines varies with state gender parity and state per capita income. The size of the circles corresponds to the number of sample schools in each state. And the measure of gender parity reflects the number of female students enrolled per male student enrolled. There's some tendency for states with higher gender parity to have a greater impact of latrines on total enrollment. And similarly, there's some tendency for states with higher income per capita to have a larger impact of latrines. I then estimate in a regression framework how the impact of a latrine changes with a 1 standard deviation change in the gender parity or per capita income of a district. These index variables are normalized to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And so, but in general, what you see is that, it doesn't actually matter about, what the gender parity or the income of a particular area is. The impact of a latrine actually stays quite consistent. As I mentioned before, the variation across sample districts, like if you really want to think about, what the variation is, because if you look at districts within this sample with average income at the 10th and 90th percentiles, it's comparable to variation across countries between the 5th and 25th percentiles of the world income distribution. And these estimates suggest that the educational impacts of school sanitation are similar across a range of less developed contexts worldwide, which really expands the external validity of estimates from within India. India is home to 25% of the world's out-of-school children, and it's important to know how the other 75% of out-of-school children might be encouraged to enroll. And in the absence of direct quantitative studies on sanitation and education in other contexts, the substantial heterogeneity in conditions within India can be used to explore how the impact of sanitation on education varies across contexts. And there appears to be very little variation in the impact of school latrines across wealthier and poorer districts within India. And while there are some indications of larger impacts in areas that have greater gender parity, perhaps because other conditions are more suitable to increasing female education, the impact of latrines remains substantial, even in contexts with lower gender parity within India. Now, because resources are always limited, it's important to understand the cost effectiveness of this intervention compared to other possible interventions that have been found to increase student enrollment. So this latrine initiative increased student enrollment by about 430,000 students across 40,000 schools at a cost of about $450 US dollars per latrine unit. So that's about $18 million total. Now this works out to cost approximately $11 if you amortize it for each additional student enrolled. Now, this is on par and actually even cheaper than most other interventions, such as school meals, teacher incentives, and school construction, with only deworming in Kenya working out to be much cheaper. But, one thing to remember is that, with deworming, that is an ongoing, that's a treatment. It's something which you have to keep doing, on a regular basis, whereas school latrine construction is, a capital investment. It's prevention, which actually might have other longer term benefits from it. So, in summary, I find that school latrines increase student enrollment and lower dropout for all students. These changes are also reflected in the number of students who show up and pass the middle school board exam. While the impact of educational infrastructure interventions can fade out over time, I find that the impact of latrines on enrollment is still present or even slightly stronger 3 years later. I also find that the impact of a latrine is similar across the 269 districts in my sample, despite the significant heterogeneity across these states. Consistent with a menstruation hypothesis.
11 o'clock at it.
Consistent with the menstruation hypothesis, I find that a latrine generally increases female enrollment more than male enrollment, but latrine type matters greatly. The construction of a unisex latrine has a greater impact on pubescent age boys than pubescent age girls, and pubescent age girls benefit very little from the construction of unisex latrine, but benefit greatly from the construction of girls-specific latrines. Furthermore, a latrine increases the share of female teachers, which may lead to benefits for female students in particular. But inconsistent with a narrow focus on menstruation, I find that while the impact of a latrine is substantial for pubescent age girls, younger girls and boys actually experience larger benefits from the presence of a latrine. For younger children, unisex latrines may be sufficient with relatively smaller additional gains from sex-specific latrines, which suggests that latrines may have important impacts through child health. And aspects of these results suggest that yes, a menstruation hypothesis may be at play, where educational decisions of pubescent age girls are influenced by the onset of puberty, but a broader view is necessary. And these results really illustrate the varying importance of health, privacy, and safety for children of different genders and ages, which is useful to understand when allocating scarce resources. So, thank you very much.
Hello?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Anjali. And we can proceed to the discussions. Dr. Peter Morgan, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. This has been a fascinating presentation. I learned a lot. Just my own personal background, my mother was a public health officer, a county health director, so I got exposed to issues of sanitation at a very tender age. So now we have two discussants. So actually, Dr. Rao has requested to go first, and so we'll let him have his presentation now. The total time for the discussion session is 55 minutes. So I'm told 12 and a half minutes per discussant. I think we can be a little bit more generous, maybe 13 or 14. So Dr. Rao, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, friends. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So we are in a different time zones. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. And CEO, Mr. Sunebe, ADBI, and also IFS UK, and my other colleagues here, moderated by Mr. Peter Morgan, my colleague discussant Jennifer, and the Anjali. The major theme of her presentation is the major discussion today. And welcome and greetings to all of you. I compliment Anjali for a very detailed analysis across geographies of India, and also her findings in the school education. The one who worked in as a chief of a education department in a state as a principal secretary, and also heading the urban sector for several years. I'm finding this entire research findings are very interesting and very educative. I compliment Anjali ji for very elaborate work and our entire team for going to the field and also doing this work. I'm sure that if you share with the Department of Education or concerned state government, they will also benefit and they will perhaps able to comment or react. So before I look into the other issues, I just wanted to give a general perception or a general development, what is happening in the sector in the country. Friends, Anjali ji has told about 1995 data, 2000 to 2004 issues. Yes, that is what I call as a old chapter of Indian sanitation and also Indian school sanitation history. And 2014 onwards, this has become a mass movement, what we call as a Jan Andolan. And because of the extensive BCC and the campaign at every village, every household, the whole tone and tenor of Indian sanitation activity, including school sanitation, has gone into a completely radical change and tectonic shift there. Now, if you see that about 95% of the schools have latrines and sanitation facilities for both boys and girls. And the data is so dynamic. Every day and every hour and every week it changes. And we perhaps have to look into the new developments and also the new trends, what is happening in the sanitation issues. Because in India, it is very difficult to call the Indian experience, because if you do something in a part of UP, that will be an experience of UP. Or if you are doing something in Gujarat, that will be an experience of Gujarat. Because India is equivalent to 28 countries. So I always tell my colleagues from the global institutions, better talk about that particular state and that particular region's experience, because India is, because of its diversity, geographical, topographical, cultural, social, and rural, urban, tribal, it is a completely different game. But anyhow, any research and any findings are always useful to learn, always useful to this thing, but depending on the topicality. So I very strongly suggest Anjali ji to perhaps take a fresh look on new developments, what are happening in the sanitation. My experience as chief of education department in a state called Tripura, which is a part of northeastern state with 70% tribals, is totally different when I worked in Telangana, that is the combined Andhra Pradesh, where 40% is the urban. So my personal view is that school dropout or continuity of the children in the school, in the education system, depends on several factors. Perhaps making school interesting, that is quality of education, and the quality of teachers and quality of the community association in managing the school's affairs, and the basic service of the school, sanitation particularly, water, toilets for the girl children, and also the school infrastructure. So multiple factors influence the attachment of the children to the school and also to the continuity. But the prime factor for girl is definitely the availability of the sanitation, privacy, and also the security, which there is no denying of the fact. In fact, UNICEF studies, not only in India, elsewhere also have proved that the drinking water sanitation and also these toilets are also major reason for girls for not attending school that during the menstruation period, are also in other all other issues are there. But only thing is, in India and also the world over, COVID-19 has perhaps made us realize the importance of sanitation, hygienity, and cleanliness. And Mahatma Gandhi ji already, we are celebrating in a big way his message of sanitation in every nook and corner. And there is a great realization now. Perhaps that is what I am seeing, that in the 2 to 3, 4 years time, there is a complete shift and change of attitudes about the sanitation, about the cleanliness in India, which is a very, very big thing. That's why mega programs with multi-billion dollars targeting rural and urban areas have been initiated, and it will be continuing, where not only the construction but utilization and also the even fecal sludge management, we want to involve the children also, so that they will be aware. So the Swachh Bharat, Swachh Vidyalaya or Clean India, Clean School campaign is a very big, is going to create a big impact, because I was noticing this UDAIS data of 2018-19 is a little older data. It says that 95.63% of the schools have the girls' toilets, and 94.59% of the schools have the boys' toilets, and about 89.97% drinking water. Of course, we can always question whether these are working or not, whether it's being used or not, but these are the official statistics. So, but I have realized that with this type of webinars and issues coming to the knowledge of the important stakeholders, it will be perhaps triggering a lot of new ideas, sharing of experiences, and also bringing value addition to the whole implementation and also to the whole perspective of the school sanitation. So I personally feel that we should share with the concerned stakeholders who are actively involved in the whole exercise, and also perhaps small booklet series, so that we can create awareness among the other stakeholders. But my friends, my personal view is that we need to continuously assess, do the research, and also including third-party involvement, and also the involvement of the academia, international organizations, NGOs, CSOs, on a wide variety of topics related to sanitation is perhaps one very good thing and important thing to happen. And the data governance is also a very big issue. I don't know about other countries. In India, we are now struggling. Like Niti Aayog has been working on the data governance and data quality and data reliability and data updation. We have large number of what we call dashboards are there, state level, district level, national level. And incidentally, now the number of districts in the country crossed more than 850, because several new districts have been formed in several countries by bifurcation and trifurcation. And every district has their own website, their own data mechanisms are there. So integrating this data and selecting again for specific research is also a very big challenge. And school management committees, that is what I realized as a principal secretary of education. If there are good school management committees, active parent-teacher communities are there, they are going to perhaps influence the maintenance and management of the latrines and also the sanitary units and behavior change communication. And children also will carry to the families the importance of the message. Second most important is that every district has a district level plans are there. I told you about more than 850 districts in all the UTs and states are there. And now because of the mechanization, automation, and also the large number of films have been made on the sanitation, including national award winning film also. And this is now discussed. Once it was a taboo, but even in the families, in the urban and rural areas, these issues are discussed. So now there is a demand for sanitary pads, vending machines in many places in the urban and rural areas, and also very, very low cost of mechanisms also have been established because of the active work of NGOs, philanthropic associations, CSOs, funded, coordinated, and collaborated by the government mechanisms. So I think that the social behavior change communication, which is a continuous activity, because every year there will be new students, every year there will be new developments in the school, and also the children can become a very strong agents of change. That is what I realized in Tripura, that children can bring a big change in the attitude and outlook of the student, parents, and also the community. And field level officials need to be sensitized again, not only in India, in all over the place, where they deal with the schools and also the children and also the communities, so that there will be a very strong collaborative mechanisms are there. And finally, I think that the more and more awareness is there in the society, in the family, and also in the community, aided, supported, facilitated by both government and non-government organizations, perhaps we will be reaching the finest point where this will become an important part of the life, which also perhaps enhancing the quality of health and also not getting affected the mandates and also the poverty. Because I worked in the health ministry, and there was there are a lot of assessments are there where sanitation related diseases is creating so much of impact on poverty, because many thousands and lakhs of families are again going below the poverty line because health related issues where sanitation and water is creating a huge impact. So combining both the experience of sanitation and also urban management, school education, I found these various analysis, various findings are quite interesting. I'm sure that it has to be done in a perhaps in a as a continued activity, so that different dimensions will come out and it will benefit these things. So Mr. Sitaram has given me, I think, 12 minutes time. So I think I'm okay with these 12 minutes. And thank you for inviting me. And I will be happy to associate with ADBI and IFS in further deliberations and also the presentation of research findings in these seminars on sanitation or any other issue which will be interesting for the urban social development and also the governance issues. Thank you very much for all the organizers, and thank you, Mr. Sitaram. I think, am I on time? I could close it?
Yes, fine. Yes, thanks very much. So let's move to our second discussant, Jennifer Orgelmayer. So Jennifer, the floor is yours. You have 12 to 13 minutes.
Great. Thanks so much to ADBI for inviting me to participate here today. It was a real pleasure to listen to Dr. Adukia's talk. This is a paper that I've long admired, so I'm delighted to make a few comments about it today. I have a few slides. I just wanted to provide a brief overview of the main results from the presentation. I know that in such a detailed and thorough paper, it's easy to get a little lost in the weeds, so I just want to pull us back a bit before I go into my comments. So the main finding that I took from the presentation is that school sanitation results in positive educational outcomes, both for boys and girls, but there was a particularly strong impact for girls at the pubescent age. School enrollment improves and dropout rates decrease, and there is also some improved school test performance. For younger children, there are good returns from unisex latrines. However, for pubescent age girls, there are only real returns from separate sex latrines. So these findings indicate that the menstruation hypothesis may be at play, but also shows the importance of things like health, privacy, and safety concerns. So if a policymaker is prioritizing different latrines in schools, we already have a really interesting policy implication from this paper. What this tells us is that perhaps unisex latrines can be targeted in primary schools, but that secondary schools, we really need to have these single-sex latrines to realize these educational benefits for girls. So throughout the rest of my comments, I'm just going to focus on other policy implications. First, I'm going to try to situate this talk in what I consider the broader literature on sanitation and education. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of examining the persistence of these effects and the importance of policies on latrine maintenance and cleaning. So Sklar et al. Conducted a really excellent systematic review in 2017 in which they linked sanitation to educational outcomes. And they explored two different mechanisms. So the first mechanism focused on sanitation either at home or at school, and having access to sanitation in the community or at home lowers rates of exposure and illness. And these lower rates of exposure and illness lead to the ability to attend school because of reduced environmental enteropathy, and also then improves cognitive development. So that's the developmental health pathway. And then the second mechanism examines how improved access to school sanitation creates a more comfortable learning environment because of improved privacy, dignity, safety. And this additional comfort is the mechanism that I believe is at play, mostly at play in the paper presented today. This additional comfort thus creates the desire to enroll and attend at school. So with that framework in place, I'm going to talk through both mechanisms, but it's important to note that most literature on WASH intervention studies find similar results to this paper, that improved WASH decreases school absenteeism and increases school enrollment. But what I think is the really important advantage of this work is that it isolates the impact of sanitation. The other papers that are out there, which are few and far between, first of all, don't have such nice causal work as was at play in this paper, but second, don't really isolate just the impact of sanitation. So while that's important, the other pathway that focuses on decreased exposure and educational impacts has also largely been explored, but most of these studies are cross-sectional in nature. And then the final piece, the work on household or community sanitation and cognition, I think is actually pretty strong in the literature. There's strong empirical work showing a causal link between early childhood access to sanitation and cognitive development. So what we can take from this literature as a whole is that both these mechanisms proposed in the systematic review are likely in place, that decreased exposure to fecal material from household or community sanitation leads to improved cognitive development, and school latrine environments improve educational attainments. So again, from a policy perspective, if our policy goal is to improve cognitive performance or improve educational attainment, then sanitation is a really, really effective tool. Okay, so now that I've situated that in the broader literature, I want to talk about the importance of examining persistent effects, which was a really, really interesting part of the paper to me. So most of the literature, this is true, I think, in most of development literature just generally, but most of the literature examining the effects of improved sanitation on educational outcomes explores the outcomes up to a year after the intervention. There are some key exceptions. The cognition literature has examined the effect of latrine interventions on cognitive outcomes 6 to 10 years after the interventions, so that's good. And in this paper, the effect of school sanitation on enrollment was explored up to 3 years after latrine construction. So that gives us some confidence that these effects will persist through time. But here, I think it's important again to review mechanisms and why examining persistence persistent effects is important because I think it differs a bit by mechanism. So for cognition, we know that lower risk of fecal exposure early in life reduces environmental enteropathy, leading to improved long-term cognitive development. So what we need for that household latrine is we need good quality latrines during child's critical development, right? So those ages 0 to 4. We got to have those good quality latrines during those years to achieve those long-term outcomes. And if we're just thinking about how sanitation links to education, we don't really need to think beyond whether the sanitation persists beyond those 0 to 4 years. We need it there for the child's critical early life period, and it produces cognition. But for school enrollment, the mechanism is improved comfort, privacy, and safety. And so for school latrines to continue to offer these benefits to children, they must perpetually offer these benefits to realize the sustained impacts on school enrollment. So what I think this tells us is that latrine maintenance and cleaning is important for all latrines, but it's particularly important for school latrines to continually offer these benefits. Okay, so this leads me to the importance of latrine maintenance and latrine cleaning policies. So with this campaign and with many campaigns, policymakers and researchers focus on initial latrine adoption or construction with little eye to how to keep these latrines offering benefits in the long term. So this chart shows some work from Orissa, India, that shows the adoption of latrines after an intensive information and education campaign that took place between 2005 and 2006. And what you can see is that between 2000 and 2005, there was a big increase in adoption. So the light blue moved significantly, and that increase in adoption continued 5 years out to 2010, though there started to be a little disuse and disadoption, that dark blue line. But then by 2016, we see that more than half of latrine owners by 2010 have disadopted or stopped using their latrines. So a latrine life of maybe 10 years for half of these latrines. So if we had, and you'll have to trust me that these results are causal. I'm just showing you the intervention villages here, but if you look the paper up, the control villages have different impacts. So if we had evaluated this campaign only after 1 or even 5 years, we would have viewed it as a success. But what happened at 10 years, some households reported that the latrines had filled and they couldn't empty them. Many had cracked or broke or got too dirty to use. So this figure was shown to you in the presentation, and it shows the increase in school latrine construction over time. And while the results from the presentation showed that the results were stronger after 3 years, which I think is very promising, what we really saw in our Orissa sample was that latrine deterioration started after that 5-year mark. So we have to ask ourselves, what will this increase in latrines have? What impact will that have in 5 to 10 years? Will we observe the same trends as we did in Orissa, India, if there are no latrine maintenance and cleaning policies in place? So to continue seeing educational returns from school latrines, policymakers must prioritize latrine cleaning, latrine maintenance, latrine emptying in schools, just as much as they prioritize latrine construction. And while policymakers do that, we researchers need to continue to adopt a more long-term perspective in our research to understand the long-term latrine conditions and the impacts these have. I saw in one of the questions someone asked, did you explore latrine quality? And oftentimes we're limited by data, but these are things that are really important for us to think about as we collect data and analyze it. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now with some other important policy and research implications that I drew from the talk. So first, we know that globally and in India in particular, girls drop out of school and attend school at lower rates than boys, particularly at the secondary school level. So what I think is really promising is that if we take as a policy goal gender equality in educational outcomes, school latrines are actually a relatively low-cost way to move towards that goal. That is really promising to me. There's also the really interesting potential mechanism of school latrines improving the retention of female teachers. So again, if this mechanism is important and is in fact driving female school enrollment and attendance, then policymakers might want to also consider parallel policy efforts to encourage retention. And then finally, the paper focused mostly on school enrollment outcomes. And again, I know we are often limited by the data that we have. However, from a policy perspective, enrollment isn't enough, right? We also need to focus on absenteeism, which is a big problem. And I think that the test score results here are really promising because that indicates that perhaps there's improved attendance as well. But again, both from a data perspective for policymakers that are recording data and a research perspective, I would say we need to focus on absenteeism effects as well. And what I think might be going on is that latrine maintenance may play a larger role on absenteeism. So if latrine construction helps us see impacts on the extensive margin in terms of school enrollment, then latrine maintenance might help us see impacts on the intensive margin in terms of school attendance and decreased absenteeism. Okay, but again, really enjoyed listening to the talk and really appreciate ADBI for asking me to comment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for excellent comments. Before I open the floor for questions, perhaps Professor Adukia might like to respond to some of the comments from the discussants.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Orgelmeyer and Mr. Rao for those very thoughtful comments. It was wonderful to hear. And, I want to underscore boldface, this this notion about maintenance and latrine use. And so, the policy that I studied was very focused on construction and maintenance. As I said, there were no resources given for maintenance. And in fact, the official policy was supposed to be that children were supposed to be the ones to clean it up, because there was this notion that, in fact, the UNICEF implementing officer said, oh, this is going to be good. It's going to be character building, and I would actually say, that you can imagine that from an inequality perspective, that actually we may be exacerbating inequality. If something is that important from an education perspective, why is it that their wealthier counterparts in private schools in Delhi are not also doing the same thing? And so I think we have to think about whatever we're asking children to do in rural areas, if it's so important, then you would imagine it from a larger, educational perspective. But anecdotally, what people would talk about in terms of maintenance is, sometimes it was used as a punishment. Sometimes it was only the kids from, lower castes that were forced to do it, that the kids from general castes were refused to do it, or the teachers were supposed to do it. And, then you could imagine exactly these issues of, is there disuse, misuse, of all sorts of kinds. And so I think maintenance is a huge issue. Moreover, so is the design itself. And so if children don't have latrines at home, they're not going to be used to it. It's kind of scary to go inside of this smelly little box where, what if it's a really big hole? Most of these are pits. And so, there are stories of kids who fell into latrines and who it was, and so, why wouldn't you want to go out in the open outdoors where it does feel cleaner and it does feel nicer in some ways than going inside of a box if it's not cleaned and if it's not maintained. And so, I think that there is research to be done to actually look at, and I noticed this one with the questions in the Q&A as well about, well, how does household sanitation interact with school sanitation? And I think it's a great question. It's something I've wondered about for a long time. And you could imagine actually trying to use the total sanitation campaign household rollout with the school sanitation and hygiene education school rollout, and actually look at, especially because they did come from offices which didn't actually really talk to each other in terms of the implementation. And so you could think about saying at the district level, or at village level, if you can get those data, which, as Dr. Orgelmeyer mentioned, data are always the limiting factor with all of these things, especially if you're trying to look at things at a larger scale. But, is it that places which had, a higher rollout in terms of households versus, schools, do you actually see improved outcomes? And how much better do you do when you actually have both? And so I think this is research that is just asking to be done. And truly the limiting factor, I think, is data, our data. And, same thing with maintenance, or quality of facility, so DICE now has added questions about like, is this a working latrine, which I think is really important. We didn't have those data for this time period. And, as Mr. Rao pointed out, like there's been this amazing increase in attention on the notion of sanitation period, but especially in schools over the last, 7 years in India. It's been very, very exciting. But the problem again are data in terms of really trying to think about causal impacts, right? So if we really want to isolate causality, that's really important. But also one thing about Swachh Bharat that really that's important is, again, they focused on construction and not maintenance. Maintenance was explicitly not something that was included. And in fact, like, even if a school had a pre-existing latrine that needed maintenance, they were more likely just to build a new one rather than repair the old one. And so I think there is this question of like, okay, it is it's a capital investment. Like these, it's not cheap, and I mean, it is cheap from a development perspective and considering all the things that we spend money on, but it is still something where, there are resources that are being put into it. And so, it's actually relatively inexpensive to hire some local person to come and clean these things. And then you're actually providing a job, and then you're maintaining this capital investment for the long run for all of the reasons that Dr. Obermeyer mentioned, that if we want to see persistence of effects, and actually in this case, I do think that we actually see both health effects and privacy and safety effects, because the fact that younger children responded even when, regardless of the type of latrine, whether it was a sex-specific latrine or a unisex latrine, does tell me that there might be, if you think about from a parent's perspective, so often parents get very sick when their kids first start attending school. And that's because there's these contagion effects. Like kids are, they don't wash their hands. And if there are worms everywhere, or if you're kids get sick because of these health issues. And so, you can imagine from a parent's perspective, if you say, well, gosh, my kid keeps getting sick at this school, it's much better for me. And then I have to take time off from work, or I've got to spend money on medicine or whatever. It's much cheaper for me just to take my kid out of school than to deal with this hotbed of contagion. And so, so I do feel like, it's, and especially latrines, if they are not maintained, they could become gross very quickly. And so I really appreciate this focus on the issue of maintenance, and appreciate your work on this. Especially doing an RCT and really looking at these effects over time. It's very, very important. I think a second issue is this question of use. So even if they're clean, it's not that if you build them, they will necessarily come, and so how do you get children to use something? And so that's where, if you think about the early days of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which was this focus on universal education, Kabir Vajpayee was the architect of all of this. And he was very thoughtful, about child-friendly design, even if the chalkboards are too high, then they're not going to be able to write on them, lower them, think about what is going to make these very attractive. And so, we want to, as much as possible, when we want take up for whatever stakeholder group it is, right? Whoever the beneficiary is, what is it that's going to attract them? What is motivating them? And especially for children, what's going to motivate them? What's going to get them excited about using something? And so, so, and I noticed one of the questions was, does the cost effectiveness analysis take the costs of maintenance? And no, because again, we also don't have great costs of maintenance, and they also didn't include maintenance. But I actually find that's what in some ways makes it so interesting to me, that we still see these persistent effects that even might be stronger. And, it's speculative, but it seems like maybe there's aspirations. It's oh, well, this place is a safe place for my daughter or for me. And so maybe I'm more likely to then, keep enrolling. And so you kind of see, in the future, and maybe people are just, on their own maintaining it. And certainly anecdotally, people talked about their own efforts to try to maintain, but these are only 3 years out. And, actually exactly what you were saying, if you look 5 years or beyond, my guess is that most of these are not in great condition. And that's a real real issues. So yeah, thank you all so very much. And I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Yeah, Mr. Peter, can I just intervene for a minute? Is it okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, because Anjali has, I think, very passionately involved in the every aspect of the research. There are just two, three minor things. I thought, Peter, I just respond to Anjali. One is the school sanitation maintenance was a big issue earlier, but there were two dimensions to it. Now there are budgeted resources for each school for engaging the people so that they maintain the latrines and also the sanitary units. And every school has a budget. Then the question is that whether they use the budget properly or not, whether there is accountability or not, there's a governance issue. But there is a budget and there is an allocation, not only by the government, even Finance Commission grants also encourage the proper management of the sanitation. The second thing you mentioned, the student community, the lower cost children, upper cost children, I don't think those issues are relevant for perhaps in majority of the schools, because the effort of the school management is to inculcate a sense of responsibility in managing their own school sanitation. Of course, you compared between urban and tribal areas or rural areas, there is no comparison. Our urban public schools, perhaps this is not being introduced or being thrust upon, but in the rural area, because of the cultural way of life, because maintaining their own house, maintaining their own community is a part of the life in the rural, tribal, and also many other areas. In urban areas, because of the disjointed efforts and the community and social issues, it is not happening. But I personally feel that as a Secretary of Education, that if the school committees, principals and teachers makes an effort to sensitize the children to maintain their own latrines and sanitary units, that is the best thing to happen. It's a very utopian idea, but it is happening in many schools. But now there has become they are engaging the people for maintenance. But your point is correct. Still the challenge is that earlier the challenge was construction of latrines. Now the challenge is that latrines are there, but how toilets you are effectively using it, maintaining it, and also managing it. So now I think a new research has to focus on BCC, cultural, social, other aspects, and what perhaps triggers a big change in the school management. I thought this quickly I intervene because I'm just boarding a flight. So I thought that I will be disconnected now. So I thought, but it's a very enjoyable and very knowledgeable. I try to give the policy perspective mostly because I'm not a academic like you, or I'm not a research scholar like you. But I always felt that research findings are extremely useful in policy development, policy improvements, and policy responsiveness, because that is what fundamentally the research meant for. Thank you very much for doing this, and all the other colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. We do have some other questions, both in the Q&A and the Menti. So first, one question in the Q&A. Thank you for your presentation. Just curious to see if you know or have done similar studies in other countries such as China and compare the similarities and differences.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, I don't know if there's studies in China, but I do know that people have now done studies specifically about school sanitation in Pakistan, in different countries in Africa. This is something which increasingly people are looking at. But I actually don't know if so it sounds like somebody can answer this question otherwise.
Somebody raising their hand on that?
Oh, it just said that.
Well, then, if I may.
Dean Sonobe, yes.
Oh, thank you very much. So thank you very much, Anjali and Jennifer and Rajesh were already left. Thank you very much for the great presentation and the discussion. And then one of my questions is very, a basic thing about the current situation about sanitation, school sanitation. So you talk was about latrine, but how about the quality of latrine? So there, the increased number of something that can be called lavatory rather than latrine. So I think is it the situation is already kind of satisfiable situation, or lots of effort is needed? So that's the first question. The second question is about kind of balance between the treatment and the comparison. So some characteristics variables are not balanced between the treatment and the control. But you can control the difference, initial difference. But how about the change in the electricity or tap water or library, those things during the data sample period? So I think the table showing that percentage change would be very helpful for readers. And also one thing about effect on exam outcomes. Yeah, so many students, I think most students are strongly motivated to pass the exam, but I guess a much smaller number of students are strongly motivated to score high. So I think the the result that scored high marks didn't have a significant coefficient. I think that's very natural for me. Okay, thank you very much.
So just to respond to first on the issue of quality, I mean, I think this is an area where, in terms of where additional data, like, a consistent, deliberate data attempts to collect information about quality would be really important. And, I think that both on the quality, maintenance, and the use, if we could have better data on that, I think that would actually, add to our knowledge substantially and actually really help us. So I completely agree that we should know more about quality. So just to kind of show you the results for, you had said the control for changes in initial characteristics. So, actually, if you let's say, so there's 100% change in getting a latrine. And actually, when you look at the changes in initial characteristics, it's actually very, very small. Like if you get a blackboard, or if you get access to different sources of water, or a playground, or some sort of a boundary wall. And so, if you control for the changes in these initial characteristics, the results actually stay the same, and it doesn't actually seem to matter. So, I agree. Like, a concern is that you say, well, there might be some meaningful differences between these schools, at baseline. As I said, it's not clear that one set of schools is necessarily better off than the other set of schools. It's like if one has electricity and the other is more likely to have computers, it's like, well, you need, electricity to have computers in the first place. And so, but, if those are concerns, given that they're concerns, it is an important part of the empirical specification.
Anjali, so all the people like me, prefer the descriptive table. Okay, thank you very much.
A descriptive table
showing the difference, not just the controlling the not the impact, so in the regression table.
Yes, I can actually show you here if you want to see. So these are the differences at baseline. So, as you can see, this is that treatment schools are on average bigger than comparison schools. And treatment schools are more likely to have electricity than comparison schools. But comparison schools are more likely to have a computer than treatment schools, and are also more likely to have, for example, a library than treatment schools.
Then, so after that, so what's the difference about the change over time?
What's the change in these particular
tap water and then electricity?
Yeah, so they're very small, and I think in the paper, actually, I don't have it here, but in the paper, I think I included the changes in an appendix, and so,
okay.
but they're very, very small.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you very much for taking time for that.
Okay, we don't have much time yet, but the most popular question in Menti is there any link between access to toilet at homes for both girl students and female teachers and demand for toilets at school?
You know, it's a question that I think is a research area that I'm very curious about as well. And you know, I think that there might be some scope to actually examine this issue with this particular policy intervention, where this, you know, SSHE focused on school latrine construction, and the Total Sanitation campaign focused on household construction. And so, you know, and because they weren't actually linked necessarily, like, you know, the two offices didn't really talk to each other, there might be some really nice scope for a future research project to try to see, you know, if different concentrations of either set of interventions had more effects than others. So if, you know, places that had, you know, a greater concentration of household latrine construction, do we see, you know, bigger effects for children compared to those, you know, in schools or what places where, you know, it was predominantly school latrine construction or vice versa. You know, you actually, I think from a policy perspective, right? Like if you imagine that, let's say on average, as we saw with that, the table that I just showed, that, you know, let's say on average, a school has 140 children. And for argument's sake, let's say that all 140 kids come from different households. You can imagine that, like, from if the biggest bang for your buck might actually come from giving one intervention to a school where you're essentially impacting 140 households, if you believe that children are social change agents and go home and nag their parents or, you know, try to encourage their neighbors, as opposed to trying to go to every single one of those 140 households and actually try to change them. So you really might actually have a huge big bang for your buck, but we don't empirically know that, right? This is just like thinking through, like you'd say, like theoretically, it seems like there actually might be a really like big benefit to doing school level interventions more often, but most of the time interventions are done at the household level. And it's unclear that that's actually the most cost-effective way to approach, but.
Okay, the next most popular question is, how did you control for the peer effect in your analysis? Example, more girls ratio in a school may attract more girls. And did you also control for the quality of latrine?
So I don't have data on the quality of latrine, unfortunately, so I can't control for that, though I'm sure that that certainly must matter. And yes, you know, so, you know, I didn't show all of the robustness checks, but, you know, I control for, you know, the baseline, you know, share of, you know, female students, the number of female students, you know, the number that have changed over time, and the results actually just don't change. So.
Okay, and here's another one. How much more or less important for education outcomes is sanitation for female teachers versus girl students?
You know, I actually think that there, you know, again, this is, I think, a project that somebody could do through surveys, right? Where you actually say to, you know, you try to find out from, let's imagine girls like this, the importance of privacy over time. You know, if you say that the importance of privacy and age, right? My guess is that it's like probably relatively flat, maybe, you know, but there's like some, maybe you care about some privacy. And then when puberty hits, my guess is that you would actually see a sharp increase that then continues for the rest of that girl's life, and likely boys too, right? I think we do understate and underestimate the importance of, you know, when we talk about gender and gender parity, if we just focus on girls, then we forget that boys are actually a really important part of the conversation. They are half the conversation. If we can, you know, encourage them and really help to also boost them, it's like all boats are going to rise. And so, you know, I don't have an empirical answer to this. I think just theoretically, you have to imagine that once you hit puberty, then suddenly privacy matters a lot. Now, like, you know, again, the mechanism matters here. So if it's not just privacy, if it's health, then it seems like health matters for younger children substantially also. So.
Okay, one last question. Even when there was no latrine, girl child stayed in school. What could be the reason?
I mean, there are many reasons why people go to school, right? So, you can imagine that you enjoy learning, that there's, there are returns to going to school. There's, benefits on the marriage market, actually, that you have a more educated daughter, a more educated, life. There are many benefits to going to school. It's just that, having a safe place, a private place for you to be able to, relieve yourself actually can matter. And that did seem to have a substantial impact on children's decision making, and potentially also this health effect that suddenly you're containing waste. It's just that, but there are many other reasons why children go to school.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, we're just out of time, so we'll have to leave the other questions for the chat, but I think it's been an excellent session. So let me thank both Professor Adukia and the discussants, Jennifer Orgomera and Rajeshwar Rao.
Thank you all so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Sitaram,
Yeah,
did you say something?
yeah. I think I was waiting for Larni to take over, but I can speak.
Go ahead.
Larni, can I continue?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to share a screen because that will summarize many things that happened or discussed today. The first point that we heard today is the importance of education. And we know the importance of education for development, but the importance of sanitation for education was brought out, particularly the importance of sanitation for girl children. And more importantly, the sanitation also, or equally importantly, for female teachers who will then be available at schools. I'm showing this because we had a program for training government officers, and it was a delight that Dr. Rajeshwar Rao, who joined us the opening of that day also, took note of this comment that I made. I tried to create a vocabulary for a new thinking on sanitation using a Sanskrit word called apana, which if you summarize it, it can be explained as A for accessibility, P for privacy, and A for affordability, and N for naturally or environmentally safe. And final A is what Dr. Rajeshwar Rao also spoke about, the action that is needed and make it really achievable. And today's session, we focused a lot more on the gender sensitivity of sanitation, particularly addressing the needs of the female and the girl children and female teachers. And we've gone quite deep into this, as Professor Sonobe, our dean, highlighted and others commented. The replication of these findings and extending them for policymakers is perhaps what is paramount and will be crucial. And I hope today's session well contributed, and we had 2 full hours, and we'd like to really thank Dr. Anjali Adukia to kind of really kickstart this joint forum that together with IFS in UK, we at ADBI, supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have started this. We'd like to continue this discussion, and we thank Professor Jennifer Orgin-Mayer for providing comments, and we believe she's also going to be contributing later with a systematic review paper, and which we hope that another occasion we'll be able to share. With that, we'd like to formally close today's discussion. I'll hand it back to Larni, because we're going to do some poll to ask you to respond how you felt about today's session, and more importantly, about the issues that were discussed. Larni, back to you.
Okay, thank you, sir. And of course, thank you to the presentation of Professor Anjali and our discussants. So we'll just have a very short feedback survey among all our participants and also the panelists. So please go back to menti.com and type the code 4976543. So that's menti.com 4976543. So you should see this on your page, and please answer this question. I like the dialogue format for this session. Simply drag the circle. So it's strongly disagree to the left and strongly agree to the right. So we just have a few questions here, and then click submit. and we will see the responses. So this is the average, 4.7. And then next question, could go to the next question. The duration was just right, and I was able to follow the presentation easily as it was with less jargon. So again, just drag the circle and click submit. So the average is 4.4 and 4.3. 4.4 and 4. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I was able to ask questions. I was able to receive a clear response to my question. Click submit. Okay, that's 4.7 and 4.4 average. And then the last one, the applicability of the study is easy to follow. The policy implications were clearly stated. I learned a lot from the session as it was more interactive. Click submit. 4.4, 4.1, 4.5. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, professors Anjali and Jennifer. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.